In this video, we're going to continue with the example from our previous video where we had the US market for motorbikes, as the example goes in our textbook, with an autarky, right, or no trade equilibrium, price of $2,000 and say 40,000 motorbikes. Just leaving the zeros off, right? So just think of it as 40. That means 40,000. And we showed then that the import demand curve will start at 2,000, right, at that equilibrium price, and is downward sloping from there. Well, now we need the other side of our market, right? So we're going to fully develop here the international market. And once we've done that, we're going to show the gains from trade in this market, and we're going to show it for the US and for the rest of the world, and then also show where we can see those gains in this international market as well. So I'm not giving you the supply and demand equations for rho, for the rest of the world, but just know that they're implicit here behind these curves. The autarky equilibrium, right, no trade equilibrium in rho, is at a price of 700 and a quantity of 50,000. Right, so clearly here we can see, right, rest of the world has a much lower price, right, again, in autarky than the US does. Right? And so that means that the US is going to be the importer in this market, and rest of the world is going to be the exporter. And similarly to what we showed with the import demand function, rho's export supply curve is going to start at their autarky price of 700, right? They're not going to export anything if the price is below 700. In that case, they would be importers. So our export supply curve starts at 700, and it'll be upward sloping from there. I often like to write export supply. You'll see me alternate these, or you can just write it as supply of exports. And just like with the demand, I tend to write MD for import demand. Different books use different notations. They mean the same thing. So if you put the two together, you'll see that our equilibrium here is at a price of 1,000. And I'm not drawing anything to scale here. I just want it to be easy to see in the graph. That's the important part, right? So obviously, it's not drawn as halfway between 700 and 2,000. The point is just to be able to see things clearly in the graphs. And so we have our equilibrium at 1,000. And in the example, we have our equilibrium is going to be 50. Now, where's that 50 coming from? So in order to see that, we're going to have to go back into our US market and our rest of the world market. And I'm going to see also where does this equilibrium price and quantity, come from? How does that work out for us? So if we put that price of 1,000 in here, right, what we would see is that in this case, quantity supplied at that lower price of 1,000 in the US would only be 15,000 motorbikes, right? So note the quantity supplied as the price drops, right? We open up to trade, price, right, initially in autarky is 2,000, it falls to 1,000. As that price falls, quantity supplied in the US is going to decrease from 40 to 15. Quantity demanded, on the other hand, is going to increase, in this case from 40 to 65. Well, 65 minus 15, 50, that is the demand for imports, right, at that price of 1,000. Right? US consumers are going to demand 50,000 imported motorbikes at that price of 1,000. Likewise, with this higher price of 1,000 here, what we're going to see is that the demand is going to drop, right? Price goes up in rest of the world when we open up to trade. So the quantity demanded is going to drop, in this case, to 25. And quantity supplied is going to go up to 75. Again, that difference is 50. That is the export, right, or quantity of exports supplied at a price of 1,000. So what, how does this price of 1,000 come about? Well, that is the price where the number of motorbikes U.S. consumers want to import equals the number of motorbikes row producers want to export to the U.S. Okay? So when we put the two together, right, at that price, we will have the export supply equal to the import demand. Right? Again, that's our concept of market clearing equilibrium. Right? It's the price such that the market clears, and it does so at this particular quantity. Now, how do we show gains from trade here? Well, one thing we want to do is look at what happens at our surplus. So we'll start here with the U.S. market, since we already looked at this a little bit before. Right? Initially, consumer surplus was this upper triangle here. Right? And producer surplus was this lower triangle. But what happens now when the price falls from 2,000 to 1,000? What's going to happen to that consumer surplus? I'm going to make sure I use the same labels for these different areas that our book uses, just so it's easier for you to follow along. So initially, our consumer surplus is this triangle, and consumers are still going to get this. But now, consumer surplus is this larger triangle here. Right? Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the willingness to pay and the price actually paid, all the way out to the, in this case, quantity consumed, which has gone up to 65. So consumers will initially get C, but now they're also going to get these areas that we're going to label A, B, and D. Okay? So A, B, and D, those areas are between the prices of 2,000 and 1,000. A is to the left of the supply curve. B is this triangle here, and D is this one. So consumers are going to gain A, B, and D. Well, what about producers? Okay. Producers initially get this whole triangle, and so we'll add E here, right? Initially, producers get A and E. However, they're now losing A, right? You think of it as A is being transferred from producers to consumers, right? It goes from being producer surplus to being consumer surplus. So as far as the country is concerned, as far as total surplus is concerned, A is just moving from one group to another. There's no net gain or loss from that area, right? So if you look at it, one simple way is just to kind of keep track of everything. So right, initially, consumer surplus is C. It is now C, A, B, and D, right? So it's a gain of A, B, and D. Producers are losing A. So the net is a gain of areas B and D, right? So this is, we call this oftentimes the trade triangle, right? The gains from trade is this triangle. Notice it is the area between the supply and the demand curves and between the autarky and the trade price. Okay? So it's the area between basically the autarky equilibrium and the trade equilibrium, right? But in this domestic market. Likewise, we can do the same thing for the rest of the world. Right? Initially, the price is at 700. And if we're looking at these areas, so we'll label, in this case, let's label this as J. Right, J is this area here. Then you have K, and the book is labeling the triangle here as N. And so what's happening? Initially, producer surplus is this triangle down here. Right? This is for rest of the world producers. This triangle here is their initial producer surplus. From their perspective, they're seeing the price go up from 700 to 1,000, and their sales increase from 50 to 75. Okay? So their surplus increases by JKN. Right. Producer surplus goes up by J, K, and N. What about consumer surplus? Well, consumers initially are getting this whole triangle up here, right? But they're losing now, so all they're going to be left with after that is this shaded area. So they're losing J and K, which leaves a net of plus N. Right? So this triangle here, again, the gains from trade are given by the autarky price and the trade price, 700 to 1,000, in between the quantities supplied and demanded. Right? So in other words, between the supply and the demand curves. Where can we see, right? So we can see very clearly both sides are gaining. Right? Now within each country, there are winners and losers. Right? In the importing country, consumers are better off and producers are worse off in this particular market. And in the exporting country, rest of the world, producers are better off with trade and the consumers are worse off. Okay? And it's easy to keep track of that. Just look at what happens to the price. Right? If you see when you open up to trade that price goes up and you're a consumer, you're going to be worse off. And if you're a producer and the price goes up, you'll be better off. And vice versa. Right? When we open up to trade, if the price falls and you're a consumer, you're better off, but you're worse off when the price falls if you're a producer. We can see these gains in our international graph here. Bear in mind, right, the US is the importer, it is the consumer in our international market. So the surplus, right, the consumer surplus from importing that the US gets is this triangle here. And so our areas B and D from this graph show up as the consumer surplus from importing. Likewise, the producer surplus for the exporting country shows up in this triangle down here as F. Right. Both countries gain. One question that often arises, well, which country gains more? And in order to look at that, you have to consider the elasticity of the export supply curve and the import demand curve, because ultimately, those elasticities determine how much the price changes from each country's autarky price. And so if you look at it here, US consumers are seeing, right, and the US is seeing the price drop significantly from 2,000 to 1,000, whereas in the rest of the world market, they're just seeing the price go up by about $300. Right? And so if we were to look at that and measure the size of these triangles, again, I haven't drawn anything to scale here, but if you were to actually look at these areas and measure them, you'd see that B plus D is much larger than F. And that's really tied to the fact that the US is seeing a bigger change in price than the rest of the world. Okay? We're not going to really push it any further than that. It is important to note that the gains from trade don't have to be equal. Right? We're not saying both countries gain equally. We are simply saying that both countries will gain from trade. Now, what perspective you take on that, some countries and some individuals think that, you know, if one country gains much more than another, that's inherently unfair. Well, those are not the kinds of questions we're going to address in this course, because we're doing what we call, right, the positive analysis. We're just looking at what is, or trying to understand what will happen without placing value judgments on whether this is good or bad, you know, better for one country versus another, or whether it's fair or unfair. Okay? The simple fact of the matter is that total surplus increases in both the importing country and the exporting country. So you take the first video along with this one, put it together. That's how we can see how we use basic supply and demand analysis to look at what happens in domestic markets when you open up to trade, and how we can show gains from trade.